All right. Good afternoon. This is August 26, 1 o'clock Legislative Review Committee meeting. And we will start off with the minutes. I found one word that Sarah has already changed for me. I'm looking for a motion to approve the minutes from our August 5th meeting.
So moved.
Second.
Second, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All right, that's unanimous. And now it's time for staff to get us started.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you, Commissioner Wright, and welcome LRC members. As you all know, the mayor has given us a lofty goal of putting together somewhat of a framework for an HRC, human relations, human rights, which we'll talk about today, type commission or council in 60 days. As a reminder, I'll read off the charge for everyone to hear. Determine ideal composition and mission for a local civil rights, human rights commission situated to provide support to the Inclusion Office. Before we get into the presentation by our Inclusion Officer, we will talk a little bit about the schedule that we have before us. In order for us to kind of get this complete within 60 days, we're going to have to do a lot of meetings. So we're going to have to meet off schedule. Today, of course, is the first meeting. September 2nd, Thursday, 1 p.m. to 2:30 p.m. would be the second meeting. Thursday, September 9th, 1 p.m. to 2:30 p.m. would be a third meeting. Thursday, September 16th, 1 p.m. to 2:30 p.m. would be the fourth meeting. And Thursday, September 23rd would be the final meeting, 1 p.m. to 2:30 p.m. So in between the September 16th and September 23rd meeting, we will have, of course, the Mayor and Commission agenda setting meeting where this item will show as a title only on the agenda. So that will be an opportunity for folks to provide public input, which we will discuss later on in the meeting. So subsequently, Tuesday, October 5th, Mayor and Commission voting meeting is what we are shooting for to have the LRC recommendation discussed. So that is our goal. There's also a potential for another meeting September 30th, as Commissioner Wright has sent out and reminded us of. But other than that, I just want to explain to everyone that, this is a really important topic, and we're going to be listening to a lot of information all at once. So feel free to ask questions whenever you have the need. And I'm certain that our Inclusion Officer, Ms. Coburn, will do a great job. So with that being said, I will stop talking and let the Inclusion Officer lead us into the presentation.
Can I just have one question just to get in my head to begin with?
Yes, ma'am.
What is are we deciding on the relationship between this committee and our anti-discrimination ordinance that we just passed, or is there reference in the ordinance we just passed to this committee?
There is not.
Okay.
I recall. It was just a commission-defined option to get us into this committee discussion to establish it. I think was. We talked a lot about the ordinance, but interestingly enough, we didn't talk about how integral a community committee would be for it. So here we are to learn about that, as everything from what to call it, how to establish it. But that's what Crystal's going to tell us about. But Carol, that's how I think of it. Does that match? Okay.
That's a great question, Commissioner Myers, and Commissioner Wright, you're exactly right. So I'm not going to steal any thunder, but Crystal's going to walk us right through the presentation, and you'll immediately see how these things may or may not pertain.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time to connect with the Inclusion Office today. As Assistant Manager Nikki Jones has shared, the Inclusion Office has been spending some time doing our best to prepare for this 5-meeting sequence that you are heading into. We understand that it is truly a massive volume of information for you to be able to take in and digest. So we have done our best to synthesize this information as much as possible, but we want you to know that we are in the process of detangling some of these pieces right alongside you. So at any point in time during this presentation today, please don't hesitate to interrupt. Please don't hesitate to ask a question. What we are going to attempt to do is to pause at the end of each slide for at least a few moments so that if there happens to be a question that's specifically related to that slide, we can go ahead and address it. We've done our best to keep this presentation compact in order to leave a healthy amount of time at the end for you to be able to engage in as much discussion as possible. And again, please keep in mind, this is the first of 5 meetings. And so any questions that you share with us today that we may need to do some additional research on, that will be our response. We're going to do some additional research and be sure to follow up with that information at upcoming meetings. Does that sound okay for everyone? Okay, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay. Okay, so the question that we've heard from so many of you as members of Mayor and Commission, as we've listened to meetings and listened to your questions, and even listening to our residents, there's this question of how do we begin? And so today's presentation is focused on a very brief introduction to forming a Human Rights or Human Relations Commission. We will not cover everything that needs to be covered today, but we will attempt to move towards a meaningful beginning. In order to frame this out, one of the starting points for us within the Inclusion Office is the Mayor's Charge. The Mayor's Charge is what helps to direct our focus, because as public servants, we have to ensure that we are being responsive to the priorities that you, our elected officials, set. And the Mayor's 60-day charge to the LRC was to determine an ideal composition and mission for a local civil rights or human rights commission that is situated to provide support to the Inclusion Office. In order to attempt to make this as digestible as possible, we have broken down today's presentation into essentially 4 critical areas. The first is focused on scope. What do you, as members of our LRC and our commission as a whole, need to keep in mind as you begin to assess what the scope of this body will be? What are the expectations that need to be set? And in thinking through expectations, there are the expectations of you, our elected officials, but then there are also the expectations of our community members. And then there are the expectations of the eventual members of this board or commission that you are about to appoint. And the next question is, so what support's needed? What does it take to ensure, as we talked about a few weeks ago in our 2-day equity training, what does it take to make sure that we are focusing on impact and not limiting ourselves to intentions? What support needs to be provided in order to ensure productivity? And then the very last question that we'll attempt to begin covering today is some factors to keep in mind as you begin to consider the selection of the membership of this body. So one of the first questions that comes to mind in thinking through HRC is, well, what exactly does HRC even stand for? So as we within the Inclusion Office began to do some digging, here are 4 variations of this acronym that we've come across again and again. Human Rights Council, Human Rights Commission, Human Relations Council, Human Relations Commission. By way of example, we have reached out to a number of localities so far. I will attempt to list them, but honestly, I may forget a few. We've reached out to Atlanta. We've reached out to Asheville. We've actually been able to connect with 2 people in Asheville. We've had conversations with Buncombe County. That's the county that actually surrounds Asheville. We've reached out to Raleigh. I think we're scheduled to connect with Raleigh next week. We've reached out to Durham, I think Portland, Oregon, and perhaps Seattle, the Office of Civil Rights. And in our conversations, we've talked with Atlanta and Asheville so far. What's interesting is if you look at Atlanta, I believe HRC in Atlanta stands for Human Relations Council, if I'm recalling that correctly, whereas HRC in Asheville stands for Human Relations Commission. So from what we can see so far, these terms seem to be being used interchangeably within the context of local government, which then begs us to ask, well, what does it actually mean? And in order to know what it means, we have to look at the scope that's defined by elected officials within a given locality. So you as our elected body will determine the scope and the power that this body that is being formed will actually have. There are 2 ways to think through the creation of a board and commission and the focus of a board and commission. This board and commission may end up being a bit more advisory. An advisory board and commission is more focused perhaps on grassroots community engagement, on proactively listening across our community, including to marginalized populations, making sure that this board is making recommendations back to you that are driven by the grassroots level across our community. So this would be a group that really has to be focused on proactive community outreach. And this would also be an entity that you could say, okay, we need to study Proposition X or the possibilities for implementing policy X. We would like you, board and commission, to give us some advice and give us some policy recommendations in that arena. One way to think through this is a bit more of a vehicle that's focused on culture change. Another approach that you could take towards this board would be more of a quasi-judicial structure. This would be a more limited scope, where this body would need to have the expertise, the support, and the functionality to be able to conduct investigations, to be able to make decisions, to be able to engage in reconciliation processes across our community. Something that was really interesting for us as we were beginning to prepare, Commissioner Wright, did you have a question? Okay. Something that was really interesting for us within the Inclusion Office as we were beginning to prepare for sharing this presentation with you today, is we realized how important it is to sort of begin to detangle the creation of a Human Relations or Human Rights Commission from the recent passage of the Non-Discrimination Ordinance. And so roughly speaking, this is not a scientific methodology, but in terms of bins to think things through, the creation of a Human Rights or Human Relations Commission falls a little bit more in the culture change, policy change type bin. We want to make sure that we're working on relationships across differences throughout our community. We want to make sure we're proactively listening throughout our community. And we also want to ensure that we're preventing discrimination, but this is a bit more of a proactive way of going about doing things. Whereas the Non-Discrimination Ordinance falls a little bit more into the enforcement bin. And so here are the behaviors that we want to have stop across our community. So the two are actually not one and the same. So in thinking through the Non-Discrimination Ordinance briefly, a helpful step for us as we were beginning to prepare to speak with you today was really taking a look at the language of the ordinance. And the language of the Non-Discrimination Ordinance has a section that's focused on enforcement, and the enforcement pathway for the Non-Discrimination Ordinance begins with the county attorney's office, where a resident will initiate a complaint by filing a complaint with the county attorney's office. And this is what the Non-Discrimination Ordinance is really focused in on, protecting and safeguarding the right and opportunity of all persons to be free from all forms of discrimination, including discrimination based on actual or perceived race, color, religion, national origin, ancestry, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, age, disability, marital status, familial status, or veteran, please excuse my misspelling, or military status. So in terms of thinking through the areas that are covered by the Non-Discrimination Ordinance, I believe that they're right around 13. There are 13 areas that the Non-Discrimination Ordinance, as drafted, specifically covers. The areas that are covered by the Non-Discrimination Ordinance are not necessarily the same as the focus areas that were identified by the task force, which led up to the creation of the Inclusion Office. This was an important step for us within the office as we began to try to detangle what are some critical pieces of information that we needed to make sure we shared with you. So the Inclusion Office is focused on race, sex, religion, national origin, disability, age, LGBTQIA+, gender identity, and socioeconomic disparity. So by way of comparison, the Non-Discrimination Ordinance covers about 13 or so areas. The ACC Gov Inclusion Office covers about, I think, 9 or so areas. So there's some additional areas of focus that are included inside of the Non-Discrimination Ordinance that actually are not included within the areas of focus within the Inclusion Office. Another way to sort of help distinguish between the creation of a Human Rights Commission and the Non-Discrimination Ordinance is to really sort of take a moment to visualize what the current enforcement pathway looks like. These are not all the steps in the enforcement pathway, but they are some of the steps that are at the front end. So a resident needs to file a complaint within a 90-day period with the county attorney, who will then conduct an initial inquiry. And if a conciliatory resolution is not able to be achieved within about 30 or so days, then the county attorney will certify that efforts have not actually resolved the complaint. And then the written complaint may be delivered for service. And internally, we are working to identify which body within ACC Gov would actually perform the function of delivering notice in this instance. And that would lead to an administrative proceeding. There could also be alternative enforcement measures that are utilized. Mediation would be one example of an alternative enforcement mechanism. And Sherry, please do correct me if I say anything completely off the wall here. In the instance that there is no finding of unlawful conduct by the county attorney, a resident can still initiate an administrative proceeding under the Non-Discrimination Ordinance.
Crystal?
Yes, sir.
If I may, I saw Commissioner Huell raised his hand. Their hand.
Yes, Commissioner Huell.
Thanks. It was back when we were on the slides of the different areas that the NDO versus the Inclusion Office is tasked with.
Yes.
And I just kind of wanted to highlight that it also sounds like the Inclusion Office is actually tasked with more, in the sense that socioeconomic disparity is added there and isn't really part of the NDO, which is a pretty big one. And then also LGBTQIA plus tends to be a broader umbrella term than is covered by the narrower definitions that are contained in our NDO. So,
Thank you, Commissioner Huell.
I think that's a very good distinction.
I really appreciate your sharing that, because I really want you to know that as we were preparing this presentation for you, we really are in the process of detangling a whole lot of pieces. And some of them overlap and they're connected, but some of them in terms of functionality are not quite the same. So I really do appreciate your pointing that out. There's another piece of this detangling that is really important. And it's the fact that there are pre-existing discrimination complaint pathways that exist within ACC Gov. So there's the recent passage of the Non-Discrimination Ordinance, but then there are pre-existing discrimination complaint pathways, for example, that live within the police department, that live within the sheriff's department, that live within HR, that live within the jail. There's the dress code ordinance. There's a recently passed non-discrimination ordinance. So if we sort of backtrack a little bit to what we were talking about a few moments ago, if you think broadly in terms of those two buckets, the sort of culture change, preventing discrimination, but also moving towards policy change bucket versus the enforcement bucket, these discrimination complaint pathways fit a little bit more into the enforcement bucket in terms of stopping behavior versus transforming culture throughout our community. So in thinking through scope, there's important distinction that needs to be made, as we talked about earlier in this presentation. And are you looking to create a body that's going to be focused on conducting investigations and holding hearings? Or are you wanting to create a body that's really focused on connecting at the grassroots level, developing programming that ensures that we're listening to more and more residents across Athens-Clarke County, that's helping you with reporting as elected officials as you're trying to identify what your policy priorities need to be, and you're wanting to understand what are our residents experiencing? What are some of the differences in background and experience, even in discrimination? What are the challenges that are happening throughout our community that we need to make sure we're incorporating into our policy recommendations? Some helpful questions to ask as you think this through might be, should you choose to create a quasi-judicial body, what are the areas of expertise that are going to be required? Are you going to be able to select people who have backgrounds as an attorney, or who have a background in conducting investigations, who have a background in mediation or in navigating official procedures? Are you going to be able to select people who will assist with documentation? And are you going to prioritize selecting a body that is going to be publicly perceived as being as objective as possible in order to ensure that there are high degrees of trust and credence given to the procedures that are implemented by this body? And are you wanting this body to engage in a process that leads towards reconciliation? What tools, education, and support may be provided in order to assist in that? If you're moving towards an advisory committee, then there's a question of, so what areas of community education do we want this body to focus on? What are some of the areas where we know we want additional engagement from throughout our community when it comes to making policy recommendations, specifically as it pertains to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and discrimination as a whole? How are we going to ensure that this body is designed to engage in proactive outreach so that their engagement is not contained within the infrastructure of local government, but so that this advisory body is positioned to function as a bridge, reaching out into our community and helping to pull local government closer to the day-to-day experiences and functionality that our residents are experiencing? And how are we going to support you as a decision-making body? Questions to ask. How are we going to support the members of this body and ensuring that within their scope, within their charge, that they're positioned to build relationships throughout Athens-Clarke County, in particular, relationships that cross differences?
Crystal,
Yes.
Commissioner Hu has their hand up.
Yes, Commissioner Hull. Thank you. I cannot see all of your faces, so thank you
That's why
so
I'm
much
here.
for pausing me. Thank you.
That's why I'm here.
Yeah, thanks. I'll just keep using the little hand. I'm not in a hurry, really, but I appreciate you. I guess I wanted to ask, where do you think the function of assisting people in navigating the process of engaging the attorney would fall? Like, is that more under the advisory or the quasi-judicial? Because that is something I kind of entered into this imagining being part of what they would do. I really like the distinction you're making here between the two. But I guess that's a question to throw out there, unless you already have an idea of which category that would fall under.
That is a really good question. So this is non-scientific. I'm going to attempt to use my hands, Commissioner Hull. So in sort of thinking through the various bins, there's this sort of culture change and preventing discrimination bin, more forward-looking. Then there's this enforcement bin. Within this enforcement bin are multiple discrimination complaint pathways that are available. And so there is this question for you as our elected officials regarding who is going to assist our residents in navigating all the pathways that are available. And it is possible that you may assign within designing the scope of an HRC, you may say a part of what we want you to do is to help to educate residents on the availability of discrimination complaint pathways throughout Athens-Clarke County. But we would also encourage you to keep in mind the functionality of local government and who on a day-to-day basis will be available to support the members of the HRC in supporting residents in understanding how to navigate the various discrimination complaint pathways. Does that answer your question, Commissioner Hull?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. So I think we're moving through things. And so we've covered scope, and forgive me, I need to look over my shoulder because there are notes up on the wall. So we've covered scope and we are moving into expectations. So as we transition, a few questions to keep in mind as we move into the next 4 meetings. What power will the HRC have? What functions do you want the HRC to perform? And what expectations will the HRC fulfill? This was a theme. We have so far had 1 conversation with Atlanta and 2 with Asheville. And this theme of expectations really has come up again and again and again. And one of the things that we're hearing from localities is it is so imperative at the outset to ensure that the expectations that are set for the HRC align with the expectations of the people who are selected for membership on the HRC. This is why the material that we covered a bit earlier in this presentation is so important. As people are selected for membership, it's imperative that there is clarity about whether they are performing an advisory function or whether they're performing more of a quasi-judicial function. That becomes critical in terms of the productivity, in terms of being able to reach out to community members effectively, in terms of being able to effectively message the functionality of the HRC so that there's engagement and participation around it, and also to ensure that this body is positioned to be able to effectively support you, our elected officials. So in thinking through expectations, there are 3 helpful questions that may be helpful to keep in mind. One is, what are our community members expecting the HRC that's created to do? What are the expectations there? And then what are the members of the HRC themselves expected to do? And then what do you, our elected officials, expect the HRC to accomplish? Each of these questions plays into the scope question that we touched on, but it also touches this piece of alignment. It's really important at the outset that we do our very best to ensure that the design of the HRC is aligning expectations with the actual functionality of the HRC. This goes back a little bit to that 2-day equity training where we sort of drew the arrows up on the board, and there was people on one side, and then there was policy outcomes on the other, and then the process arrow in the middle. This is sort of going back to that. So right now we are in the process of deciding what the recommendation back to the full body will be. You, our elected officials, are in the midst of that process. And it's imperative that we ensure that the expectations of the people who are involved are aligned with the policy outcomes that you're wanting to move towards. And so in addition to the 3 questions that we talked about a few moments ago, it's imperative to really ask, so exactly what power will you, our elected officials, grant to the HRC? And how will you ensure that HRC members are supported? Something that's come up in talking with other localities is the importance of an onboarding and training process in order to make sure that the participants on the HRC don't just sort of feel like they're kind of like tossed out there and being expected to figure it all out, but they actually are being supported and becoming equipped with the tools that they need to be able to perform the function that they're being asked to perform. And one locality also mentioned that training probably should not be a one-time type training, but it needs to happen on an ongoing basis, so that ideally the HRC is building a reputation throughout our community as really being focused in and developing expertise in the scope that you, our elected officials, identify. There's the question of who will develop a work plan? Who is going to ensure that each year the HRC knows where the focus needs to lie, so that it's less of a everything coming together and then confusion, and more of a here's where you're focusing, here are your key performance indicators, here are the objectives that you're pursuing, and then what steps will be taken to ensure that those objectives, again, really closely align with the policy outcomes that you, our elected officials, are wanting to see. And then there's a question of how will residents know what's happening? How will residents know that a Human Rights or Human Relations Commission or Council has been created? How will residents know this is the work plan of the HRC? How will residents know here's how I can engage with the members of the HRC? So there's a really critical piece of communication that also plays into this alignment factor that we need to keep in mind. So some factors to keep in mind as you think through what does support need to look like for members of the Human Rights or Human Relations Commission? What will onboarding look like? What will it look like in terms of this body making policy recommendations back to you, our elected officials? Is this something that needs to happen annually? Is this something that needs to happen each quarter? Is this something that needs to happen biannually? What budget will be allocated to the membership of the HRC in order to implement programming or to engage in marketing efforts or to engage in proactive outreach? Are there specific areas of expertise that you would like the members of this the members of this HRC to be able to have? Are there specific areas of focus that you're wanting the members of the HRC to focus in on? Are you wanting to ensure that they're supported in ways that allows them to build expertise over time? Or are you wanting to take a more generalized approach and the development of a work plan and the implementation of programs to ensure that the work of the HRC is building and growing and sustainable, but also is becoming more and more visible over time? These are some helpful factors to keep in place when you think through what support might be required for this body. And then the last area that we wanted to touch on today before we create some room for you, our elected officials, to engage in active discussion on this is the selection process. So this is providing you, our elected body, with the opportunity to potentially pilot a different approach. One of the things that we touched on briefly during that 2-day equity training was some areas that are actionable right now. And one area that's actionable right now is taking steps to increase diversity, equity, and inclusion in the selection of residents to membership. on our boards and commissions. And depending on the scope that you identify for the HRC, something that's going to be really critical is to ensure that we are reaching residents from throughout Athens-Clarke County in terms of the membership of the HRC and then also the knowledge that the HRC is in existence. And so to involve residents throughout neighborhoods across Athens-Clarke County, we may need to be willing to pilot a selection process that differs from the norm. And one thing that we think about a lot in the Inclusion Office is that this work neither begins nor ends with us. So we know that for a very, very long time, the work of diversity, equity, inclusion, of anti-discrimination, it's been ongoing throughout our community. And one critical step that you, our elected officials, might consider in piloting an alternative approach is to ensure that the organizations and community leaders who have played and continue to play such a critical role in doing this work are positioned to assist in pushing this opportunity out into the communities and the neighborhoods where they have built trust, so that we are able to reach more and more residents in terms of really reaching people across neighborhoods throughout Athens-Clarke County. So one question for you to consider is, are you willing to pilot a different approach? Keeping in mind that piloting this alternative approach might actually assist with providing a template for other boards and commissions that exist throughout our local government. And one idea, it's, not a complex idea, but one idea, for example, would be if you were to identify a runway, a period of time through which we could actually advertise and market that this opportunity is available. Perhaps we could get on WXAG and we can get on WUGA and make sure that people really know. We can connect with multiple community members, multiple organizations to ensure that people know that an HRC is being formed and that there is an opportunity to become a member. As a member of this inaugural group that will form this board and commission. That's a small example of a step that we might take to ensure that we are being more broadly inclusive throughout neighborhoods across Athens-Clarke County. So just by way of a quick recap, please forgive me, I needed to edit this slide a little bit as well. The charge to you was to determine the ideal composition and mission for a local civil rights or human rights commission that's situated to provide support to the Inclusion Office. And we have gained hopefully a little bit of clarity today. The creation of a human rights commission or human relations commission is not the same as the passage of the Non-Discrimination Ordinance. We know that it's imperative to decide whether you're wanting to head in the direction of creating a body that's more investigatory or creating a body that's more heavily focused on engaging at the grassroots level of our community, really moving culture change forward, and also circling back to you, our elected officials, with recommendations for incorporation into policy priorities. It's really important to ensure that expectations at the outset are aligned with the functionality of the HRC from the front end. And then it's important to ask the question, is the support that's being provided, does it actually match the expectations that are being set so that we can distinguish between our intentions and the actual impact that this body will have throughout our community? And then there's the question of identifying how members will be selected for the HRC. Thank you so much for being willing to participate in this presentation. And we'd like to be sure to pause and open the floor for any questions that you might have.
Wow, that was really quite the jumpstart in presentation. You covered a good bit of things that I really appreciated. Shall we go down the line? We've got Ovita with us as well. Does anybody have a hand up to give some more input or questions? Remember, not all the questions might be asked right now. They might just be taken in for follow-up like we do for agenda setting. Carol?
Yeah, I just want to reiterate, Allison, what you just said, that this was like great and covered so many points. I love the idea of piloting a process to get more diversity, to true diversity on the board, and trying something different, because we clearly need it for this committee, but we need it for all committees. So I'm eager to see what we can do in that area.
My hand is not up because my camera is off, but
go ahead, Ovita.
I do. Thank you, Madam Chair. I do want to ditto Commissioner Myers' comment. This is, I don't know, what this presentation means to me is more than the HRC process. It looks like we are creating a model that could be used in other areas. Maybe not as much, maybe the details might be a little different, but I get very frustrated when things come from all different directions and we don't have a path. This to me looks like it creates a model how other ideas and process, and that we're not all over the page, but we have a process that we follow. Maybe we have always had a process and maybe we just haven't followed it, but I do hope we can cement how we proceed on issues in the future. So it was a very enlightening, very educational, very objective, very objective way of tackling a very sensitive issue. Thank you, Krista.
Commissioner Thornton.
Commissioner Huell.
Thanks. Yeah, I guess I'll chime in just to also say this was fantastic. I love how you really operate in questions, and I think you've given us a lot of great questions to chew on. So procedurally, I guess part of me wonders, like, how do we as a committee plan to tackle these questions? You know, do we want to go through them one at a time while we're here discussing? Do we want to try to sit with them and write out some thoughts that we share by email and come back together to discuss, you know, where the intersections are on our responses? But part of me has kind of this process question about how we address those many questions, all of which I think are extremely important. And I guess, you know, one other thought I have is, if we're trying to get some kind of a body established, is there a value in us getting one established before we fully answered all the questions we could, and then kind of iteratively, you know, with whoever is on the HRC once it's created, kind of figure out how it may evolve over time, you know? So I guess that's maybe an overarching question of how much do we need to front load the strategic planning of this thing before it launches versus, you know, let it grow with the involvement of other people that we're kind of bringing on board to be a part of it. And the last question I have for you, Crystal, is did you come across any examples of HRCs that were serving both functions? You know, that maybe generally there's an HRC that's advisory and there's maybe like a subgroup that's quasi-judicial in nature, or that there are like parallel committees within it or something?
So we have had conversations so far with two people from Asheville, one person from Atlanta, one person from Buncombe County. Buncombe County does not have an HRC, but they recently passed a non-discrimination ordinance, and they're the county within which the city of Asheville sits. And I think, as we mentioned earlier, we're speaking with Raleigh next week, and we've reached out, I think, to Durham and Portland, and I think Seattle. Thus far, in the localities we have interacted with, no. We have not come across a model that seems to be both. Within Atlanta, from great conversation with an administrator there, their human relations council is more the investigatory pathway. So they actually administer the process of hearing complaints, if we understood them correctly. Whereas in Asheville, their HRC is more advisory. So their HRC is designed to be more focused on the community outreach, community engagement piece of things versus the investigatory piece of things. So no, we have not. But I have a massive disclaimer for you. This document was printed from DOJ and contains a really extensive list of Human Rights and Human Relations Commission, and we have not reviewed all of them. So that's the disclaimer.
Well, well, Jesse, to kind of touch on the process and for the committee's charge, and I think it's great that we're going to be meeting every week and we're going to stay fresh on this topic with it. I kind of need to process what was given to me today, presented, and then I was thinking, like as you pointed out with the questions, that we're going to come back to those. I would think that as we are learning and being presented to by these other community groups that you guys have gotten on the docket for us, I could see that in our minds we're asking these questions, but yet I think as a committee we are going to need to go back to what Crystal brought forward in some of her questions and see how many of them we can answer and tackle now, as well as asking for time to set up the pilot outreach program that's allowing us to get more neighborhoods, if that's sort of a direction we go with that idea. I think that's going to help us with a number of our upcoming needs for community groups that can be a strong voice for us, as well advisory is, or whatever we decide. The outreach and how do we get members and the expectations of the members. Those are all key things that need to be, I agree, need to be addressed.
Commissioner Wright, if I may, you hit the nail on the head related to the next meeting, listening to the best practices from other communities, kind of thinking through their scope, what has worked well for them, what has not worked so well for them. But Commissioner Huell, you're right about the questions that, Crystal did a great job putting these questions forward. Y'all, because we're on such a tight time frame here, I think it's going to be really important for us to give you some homework. Okay, in between meetings, feel free to reach out to staff. I would send an email out to all the members of the LRC if you have a question, so everybody can be involved in this conversation. But there needs to be work done in between each meeting if we want to be successful in meeting this 60-day time frame.
And on that note, I'll go ahead and put one of my questions out there that, again, I think when these email questions come up, I think that reply all is good so that we're all continuing to have that back and forth and make our meetings as productive as possible. I'd be interested in understanding legally what the quasi-judicial type committee, or if it's a subcommittee, or that kind of group, a community group. I'm trying to understand legally how that can come about without it becoming slanderous, or making sure that it's not taking on what is really the attorney office. But Sherry, is that something you can give us some feedback on later?
Sure. I mean, and I think it really depends on what you all mean by a quasi-judicial process. And so, the idea that this board might be fielding complaints, if they're going to be something that would be done by the ordinance, it would be better to have it go through that process, because we certainly wouldn't want something to be done by a citizen board that might in some way cause difficulties with that legal process. I guess the question, and maybe I don't want to pass the buck to you, Crystal, but I'm curious what sort of quasi-judicial examples, if any, you have from other communities that you've heard of things that they work on that might be separate from the NDO.
I think, so there are a few thoughts that come to mind there. One takes me back to some conversations that I think we've had between the Attorney's Office and the Inclusion Office, just specifically with respect to the Non-Discrimination Ordinance. So one thing that I think it may be important, and Sherry, as always, please correct me if I'm off the wall. One thing that I think might be important to keep in mind is that the Non-Discrimination Ordinance does not preclude the person who files a complaint from seeking additional remedies. So that means that a resident can file a complaint under the Non-Discrimination Ordinance, and they can also file a complaint in, court, and they can, go through, they can file an EEOC complaint, and they can file a HUD complaint. You can pursue multiple remedies simultaneously. But something that may be important to keep in mind, and I have to credit Sherry for bringing this up, is that these proceedings are taking place in a public arena. So a resident is potentially creating a record when you think in terms of evidence that could also potentially be used by more than one party potentially to a complaint that's filed in another venue down the line. So that's something that it would be important to have someone who is helping residents navigate through this process to help the resident understand at the front end of things. And it would also likely be very important to have a person to help the resident not just understand what's happening at the front end, but to remain in consistent contact with the resident as they would go through a process such as this one. That is similar to the format that's being utilized from Atlanta, based on the conversations that we've had thus far. There is an administrator who is in their office, I believe, of constituent services. I might have butchered the title of the office. But the real role that she plays is to actually conduct the investigation, and she helps to provide notice, and she helps to bring the members of this body together so that they are then able to go through a process, but their priority is reconciliation. So that was something that was quite interesting in having that conversation with Atlanta. The way they go about navigating a process such as this is to educate the entity that's involved, as well as supporting the resident who's going through the process. Does that respond to your question?
I think that helps. Thinking through, just trying to imagine what that would be like. The real question is, what's the remedy? Like, what is the point of having some sort of quasi-judicial process through this Human Rights Commission? And I think it makes a lot of sense if what we're talking about is someone, like take a relatively recent example, someone sees an employee post something on social media that they think is inappropriate or offensive, and maybe they want to file that complaint, and maybe there's some investigation into that. Is that something that we would want to be handled by a Human Rights Commission? Currently, that would be handled really by my office and HR in conjunction with the departments, and that is a really effective process in the sense that it allows us to maintain some confidentiality, in a way that, at least until that investigation is over, things are not releasable. And that just gives us the chance to kind of gather all that information before things kind of come out into the public's realm. And so you all may be familiar that because of the Open Records Act, internal investigations aren't releasable until 10 days until after they're closed. So if you are thinking that, okay, this is a process that might apply to complaints related to employees, you would probably want to think about how that might impact that, and the fact that, maybe these investigations would be open to the public sooner. I'd have to think about that more thoroughly. So I guess my point is, if we already have a non-discrimination ordinance, if we already have internal processes that we're comfortable with that investigate complaints, I don't know if there's a need for a judicial process, or a quasi-judicial process, but maybe there is. I just would like to know what you all think is missing, I guess, what you would like to see this group do that might be quasi-judicial.
Okay, well, the discussion in itself is helping me as far as thinking, of the list of things and the questions we want to answer while in the next working on this topic, is navigating versus outreaching versus educating versus that kind of stuff. So Jesse's hands up. Go ahead, Jesse.
Yeah, I guess I just thought I'd share, my take on this question we're talking about right now, which is the quasi-judicial versus advisory. In my view, at least to start, I don't see this HRC serving a quasi-judicial function, except insofar as we think that helping people demystify the process of filing complaints and all the different places that they can do so is that. So if we think of that as part of it, then I would like to see this body, just like help be a resource for residents to understand all the different types of complaints that do exist and sort of the basics of how to go about doing that. But beyond that, I feel like it's more everything that Crystal put under the advisory capacity that makes a lot more sense to me, at least to start. And maybe over time, as they're hosting public forums and giving policy recommendations, it becomes clear that there is some kind of definable gap that could be filled by serving a quasi-judicial function, but that's like a bridge to cross down the road if and when. So in my view, that's the the place to start, but I'd really love to hear y'all's thoughts on that.
I do agree. Again, I'm sorry, my hand is up, but y'all can't see it. That Crystal, with your research, do you have any idea how many complaints have that? Did you look into that? How many complaints some of the agencies were receiving in any of these maybe discriminatory actions? Are there any numbers that you're aware of?
Commissioner Thornton, that is a fantastic question. It's almost like you've been sitting inside of our office listening to us attempt to prepare this presentation. And I happen to know the answer to this, but the only reason I know it is because I listened to Sherry. And so, Sherry, you mentioned this on a call earlier today. And I don't know if you might be willing to share the number of complaints that have been filed under the dress code ordinance that's been in existence for a few years now.
Sure. So in terms of the dress code violation or ordinance, there's only, I believe, been 3 that have been filed. One of them, I think I said earlier that it was basically unsubstantiated, but I think what happened is the person contacted our office, said that they were interested, and never actually submitted a complaint. Like, we never actually got what we needed to move forward. With the other one, they did file a complaint, but we needed additional information and we could never get that. And then the third one, we did actually get a valid complaint. We did move forward, and that's the one that led us to federal litigation over the challenge, our dress code ordinance, and that we won. So we've only had those 3 in the entire time that we've been here. We have made efforts to try to work with the police department to get to gather those cases. Now, that's specifically the dress code violation. As far as other types of complaints, I know the police department, gets a number of complaints. We've been talking about the task force, but that isn't just related to these types of topics, but all total, it's about 50 a year. And that's the whole range of complaints that they get. And then the only other type of complaint that is along these lines that I can remember is one that we've had in the last year. So I don't know, there may be other departments that, have that information that I don't have.
Well, I will then say this is a good time to promote this, to promote an advisory committee. It would be a good time to start collecting data before we move into a quasi-governmental entity that does not have any teeth behind it or legal action. I think that for me, I would agree that we move forward in exploring an advisory committee rather than a quasi-legislative committee. And then during that time, start compiling the kind of data that may need to lead into something with a little bit more bite to it. So I agree that further research or study should be towards advisory.
Thank you, Commissioner Thornton. Commissioner Myers, you're muted. Commissioner Myers,
Got it.
there you go.
I'm just following up on that, on the numbers. I remember hearing a good year, if not more, listening into one of your meetings when I was not present in it, making reference to, I guess there was a query when you were putting together the ordinance about the ordinances in other municipalities in Georgia and how many complaints had been filed. And it might be helpful to sort of go back to those contexts and see what's happened in those communities again a year later, because I know those anti-discrimination ordinances were fairly new anyway when you referenced it. So I don't know if we have data about that or could get that data as well. I think there was that discussion about like getting the information out to the public, that educational role about this. And wondering what's going on in those other communities, if they're being effective, if they're not getting the complaints because they're not, people don't know about them or intimidated to put them through and such. So maybe we could get a little information on that as well.
So Carol, are you saying that as we're working on this community committee definition and mission and stuff, that you're wanting us to get more about our educational toolkit that the manager's putting together? Because I think they might have to put that. I don't know that that's still going forward now that we're trying to focus on the composition of this committee.
No, I guess it was more having to do with, I mean, I think when I remember where I was walking when I was listening to this meeting, and you were talking about in Brookhaven and some other places, and some people in the attorney's office had some contacts with people in these other municipalities to see how many complaints had come in. And in terms of us discussing this quasi judicial role, you know, if we see that there aren't that many complaints coming in other places, not to put the emphasis there, but to go along with what you're saying in terms of educational, maybe advisement, and seeing if there's, you know, if that role needs to be reassessed in a year or so. I'm just wondering how much action these ordinances have gotten in other places, just in terms of numbers. Like Brookhaven now has had 10, you know, or whatever else, 10 complaints filed or inquiries. I'm just up-to-date numbers.
Okay, Sherry's hand is up. Let's let her go next. And Jesse, I see your hand up as well.
In short, I was just going to say that I was the one who provided information. When we last talked, all of these communities said that they'd had one or two, maybe zero in most of them. Judge Hope actually reached out to the municipal court judges that are in those areas, and not a single one let him know that, or rather they let him know that not a single complaint had made it into their courtrooms. And I think Crystal hit on this before, but just to make it extremely clear for those who may not have been part of those conversations, I think the fundamental issue is that these non-discrimination ordinances do not provide excellent remedies for citizens, right? It's $1,000 fine that goes against the business, and none of that money can go to the citizen bringing the complaint. So if you think about the trauma and the stress of having to go and speak about, you know, how you were discriminated against, and then not only knowing that, as Crystal said, that you're creating a record, which then can be used against you at a later court date, and maybe you were stressed, maybe you didn't testify as well as you intended. So it's basically all risk, no reward for someone who's bringing forward a complaint other than this small penalty against the business, which doesn't mean that we won't get them, but I think that's the explanation for why these communities are not seeing a lot of complaints, because if you do have a good complaint, it makes a whole lot of sense to go to the EEOC or HUD or someplace else to pursue it with private counsel.
Thank you for that explanation. And Commissioner Huell, and then Commissioner Myers, is your hand just left up from before? Okay, Commissioner Huell.
Thank you. So two other thoughts I'd like to share for today. One is when we're thinking about pathways, I'd like us to consider pathways that are outside of our existing criminal justice system. So what we might think of as restorative justice pathways, but two that come to mind, one that's already in existence is the Georgia Conflict Center as a place to refer people to, but another is, you know, the project that members of EJC and others in our community are working on of getting a worker center going. I imagine there's going to be value there in helping people navigate their rights, and also, like, you know, how to organize as employees to better their work environment and things. So. And I'm sure those aren't the only ones in the community. So just moving forward, expanding that list of pathways seems valuable to me. And of course, AADM, Athens Anti-Discrimination Movement, has also been doing some work to date already in the community. And so figuring out how their work might continue to dovetail or relate to what we're doing here. And then I guess I just wanted to throw out there, so maybe we can try to get on the same page sooner than later about what we're calling this thing. I'd like to make the case for Human Relations Commission. And my thinking there, basically, you know, this comes down to whether we want to say relations or rights. I think that we're talking about things that go beyond just rights that are codified in federal and state law, especially when we talk about things like socioeconomic status or ways that people can identify as queer that aren't yet protected classes. So in that way, I think relations speaks more strongly than rights to what we're going for. And then also when we're talking about facilitating connections in the community and trying to build a greater understanding that goes beyond just the exercise of your legal rights, but about how we relate to each other. And then for commission versus council, I just think, commission generally sounds more empowered. There might not be a legal distinction between the two necessarily, but certainly as we're trying to move towards this body, perhaps having some authority on things, certainly looking for official recommendations from them. I think commission is a stronger word there. So that's my case for that.
Well, it also fits in if this is going to become a new board, authority, and commission. It fits in that as well, as far as if that's how that ends up being listed. And then speaking to with some of my new terms from today, the advisory committee approach is doing that transform cultural changes, Jesse, and I think that aligns too with what you're saying is human relations for that. Well, on the note of us with public input and learning about what others in the community, Nikki, I was going to touch on us talking about public comment for our work. Is this a good time for that?
Yes, ma'am. I think that's appropriate.
Okay, so we had that great presentation from our inclusion officer. And we all have heard we're going to have homework, so keep your LRC, make sure you keep an eye out for your LRC emails, question and answers. But so I wanted to learn from the committee about our options for public input on this topic, as well as when in our process we're learning, but then when we start formulating, what point is it we want to reach out to Jeff Montgomery's team and give Sarah plenty of time to learn what it would take for people to sign up and have a 3-minute with the committee or something like that. Have y'all thought about that, or you want to just think about that and us nail some more things down about how to do that, if to do that, and at what point of our meetings do you want us to add that in?
Woman.
Go ahead, Ovita, since we can't see your hand up, and then we got Carol, and then Jesse.
I guess I wasn't prepared as to make that decision today. I mean, but whatever the group comes up with is fine. I really would like to see a summary of what we have discussed. I think I know, but I would like to see something in writing, either before we have this input, or at least by the time we have input. So the input part doesn't bother me at all, but I heard some good ideas, but I want to make sure I understand some of the options and suggestions that were made. So I would like to see something in writing.
So am I hearing that you're thinking more further down in our committee work would be a better point for us setting up public input for the committee meeting?
I'm gonna be honest with you. For me, it would be better.
Okay.
But for me, it would be better. I surely do not want to tax staff to hurry something along. But I definitely would like something in writing before or by the time we have input. For me, it would be better down the road, but I know there's some rush bees here, or a need for a rush from some of us. So I'm good.
Okay. Well, I want to highlight some public, what our calendar looks like for September, and then Carol, and then Jesse. So on September 17th, that's when the agenda packet will go out. And this topic is going to be title only for our agenda meeting on the 21st. So that gets it on the agenda that people can start giving us with the online comments, as well as having podium time on this topic. So that's helping us, or gives us an opportunity for the community to share what they maybe have already been thinking or what they want to share. And we're scheduled to have something, a product advice or recommendation in the agenda packet for October 1, that Friday, for the 5th voting meeting. So that again is that public input phase. So we've got those two outlined. And then I just want to add that while we're talking about potentially adding committee input. Carol?
I'm looking at the agenda for today, then September 2nd and September 9th. And I've already learned a lot today. This was a really good presentation and discussion. And then we have the best practices and possible presentation on possible framework. I'm wondering if somehow, so I don't think we should have it until after that. And somehow I would like to communicate some of that information to the public so that they those who wish have a little bit more understanding of what we're already discussing and maybe can profit from the work that staff has done. And is there any way that if we did have this if we were thinking, okay, we're going to get public input at the agenda setting meeting, that we could have more than title only and have some link there to previous LRC meetings and the presentations, so that people who are coming into this could go and look at those things and perhaps be a little caught up with the discussion before they get to the podium. And so the question, so that's one thing. And the other thing is there any precedent of having public comment specifically for the LRC committee, like for the GOC committee rather than at the larger? Is that even an option? I'm just getting some sort of historical background on that.
I see some staff members shaking their head and raising their hands. So Nikki, I'll let you pick up on input from Carol's.
I was going to comment on Commissioner Meyer's first question related to, can we put together some sort of summary, or I'm paraphrasing here, kind of synthesizing what we've discussed over the first 3 meetings or whatever, and have that as part of the agenda where we had mentioned title only. And I think that kind of gets back to Commissioner Thornton's question about a summary. And I think, staff could certainly make sure that there's some sort of summary about the first 3 meetings and attach it to the agenda item. It wouldn't be a full agenda item, of course, but there would be a summary there for someone to be able to kind of read and digest what we've kind of discussed.
I appreciate that. And that can also lead back to, as you recommended, Carol, given a clearer point of how to find these meetings, because this presentation that we had in our discussion today and all of our meetings are viewable, recorded, and then archived. So we can point people back to our learning process as well.
And perhaps, Crystal was referring before to communicating some of this stuff via WXAG or something or other to get that input in sooner, or information that this is all happening, whether or not there's any possibility of doing that, so that we hear from diverse voices.
Okay.
I definitely, that was definitely my point. And I appreciate Nikki saying it is possible. I do think there are some people who are watching this, and there are a lot of other people who are interested that don't know about it. And we just need to do all we can to get the word out, because I think this is very important, not just for a few people that several commissioners speak to or about, but for a larger majority, because it does impact the community.
Okay, Jesse, if you'll hold on and let me get staff to comment from Carol's. Blaine, you want to go ahead, and then Sarah?
Thank you, Chair. And totally understand what you're trying to achieve, and think it's a great idea to get it out there and let the public respond to it. I'm not sure the agenda item would be the best way to do that, only because people look to whatever that placeholder is as a signal towards a recommendation. And I know that we have title only. I don't know what placeholder you would want there, other than summaries of the initial meetings, if that's where people go to find out what direction the committee's headed in. So I don't disagree with what you're trying to accomplish, but if we use that opportunity or to develop a different one, I don't mean to complicate things.
Well, I see that at that point in time agenda summary that sort of summarizes where we are as of September 17th, right? Because that's when that Friday agenda item would go out. And then by the time it's the October 1 agenda report, we're filling in what we've been doing for the other meetings. So it's a snapshot, but Blaine, I've always thought that we should have archives of our work sessions and presentations to where people can refer back to it, because we can't necessarily email this stuff to people. Is there a space out there that we could have like our LRC highlighted topic?
As far as like
page of the website
for past work sessions, because I think we've got the YouTube, but you're talking about the actual presentations themselves.
Yeah, I'm talking about our committee work, making sure we're promoting our transparency, promoting the information that we're talking about, making sure that when members see that we're having meetings every week, community members, they might see enough about this meeting to make sure they're involved and engaging with us. It doesn't have to be podium how we're getting feedback from people. We got phone calls, emails. People are going to seek us out, but we want as many people to know what we're working on for that input. If I'm hearing that from everybody.
And what we've archived from committee work, we need to work with the clerk on and see what she's, good with, of course. And I think Sarah may have some insights on public input as well. But whatever we appreciate the ideas. Whatever we can do to promote transparency and understanding, we're all about.
Okay. All right. So Sarah, and then Jesse, I've still got your hand up, sort of. I've got it down. Okay. Sarah, what kind of input did you want to give us? And then we'll get to Jesse's input or question.
Yes. To Commissioner Meyer's question, you asked about historically how public input has been taken in our LRC and GOC meetings. So COVID kind of changed things a little bit. So there are pros and cons to having virtual meetings. It's great for our schedules, and everything is really easily accessible to the public because they can watch recordings at their own time of the meetings. When we were meeting in person, traditionally the way we've approached subcommittee meetings of the mayor and commission is that public is allowed to attend. They can always come and watch the meetings. But we do not take public comment unless the committee chair, in this case, Commissioner Wright, wanted to recognize someone and ask them to provide their input. That said, I did kind of initially have some conversations with our public information office. And one of the things that they suggested that we might consider is, given the fact that the public is oftentimes watching the meeting recording, not necessarily tuning in right at 1 o'clock, we may consider having a form created similar to how we do take public comment for agenda items with mayor and commission meetings just traditionally, and having that public input form have those responses automatically go out to the commissioners on the committee. So that is an option that you might consider that might meet that need that you're looking for public input. Alternatively, we can also work to see what options there are to promote emails and phone number, like contact information for the commissioners who are here on the committee in case the public wanted to reach out to you individually. So I just wanted to offer that as a couple of options for you to consider. Thanks.
Sarah, thanks for bringing that up, because we talked about that last week, and I wanted to let the committee think about it as we go on, see how we have this sort of long thing on the agenda that's talking about the special events thing. Like if we took that off, to be thinking about for our agendas during this crunch time, if we just had the committee's name, committee member names, phone number, and email, and just sort of spoon feed the contact of the community with us by having it on the agenda. So think about how you feel about that, and if you think that that would be a relevant outreach approach. Okay, thanks, Sarah. Did I interrupt you, or were you finished? You're good. Okay. All right, Jesse.
All right. The great thing about being in a room full of good folks is that when you go last, you don't have a whole lot of new stuff to add. But I guess I'll share. I'd love to have at least one of these meetings in person. If it works for PIO to set up in the chamber like we do for mayor and commission meetings and be able to take public input at the podium for at least one of these, I do think that would be a really valuable opportunity to provide. Who knows how many folks will take us up on it because it is in the middle of the day, but I'd love for that to be an option at some point. And I'd just like to throw out there, kind of piggybacking on what Sarah was talking about with a public comment form, having a survey. I'm thinking of just like a short, I usually work with Google Docs, so it's usually like a survey on Google Docs, but something that's the like 5 best questions we think we want to ask, specifically pulled from Crystal's presentation that we really want public input on, and just having those on like a quick and easy form, perhaps with like an introductory explanatory thing at the top, and then posting it. We use these short links a lot, like we have accgov.com/vaccine. So having accgov.com/HRC, and that can just be a link that we push out everywhere, that we mention on the radio, that we have put on our agenda, like you're talking about, Commissioner Wright, and that can just be like kind of a place to try to push people, where we're directing the kind of input we're trying to get around the questions that we think are most important to be asked of the public, perhaps with like an open-ended question at the end where people can just throw in whatever they'd like on top of that. But if people like that idea, I think a guided survey like that might be good.
Yeah. Oh no, I agree that every option should be out there, but with the dismal response we got from the National Citizen Survey, and that maybe not being everybody's thing to do is complete a survey. I was going with the old-fashioned phone call, email outreach, but I think I might get staff to speak to the status, but mainly with the COVID and the mask mandate. I think that we're backing away from live meetings. Is there a staff member who wants to speak to that?
I'll defer to the manager on this one.
Well, we don't have a hard and fast policy against having live meetings, and I know the mayor has been, making the call, if you will, with regards to the commission meetings. We have a mix of WebEx and meetings here, depending on the duration and the number of folks involved. In all cases, everyone must wear masks. So I would really defer to the chair on that, your preference on that, and I think that's in organizing the meeting something that y'all could meet here, but once you come in the building, you have to wear a mask. Is what we would recommend, or you can meet WebEx. I don't think there's a wrong answer.
Well, this is specifically, and Jesse, make sure I'm capturing this right. This would be specifically for us to have that easier public input opportunity.
I got you.
So that we would, once we're in our countdown in progress of this meeting topic, that we plot which meeting is going to be the public input one type thing. Right. And Jesse, then that meeting would be at City Hall so that folks could get their podium time. Again, not everybody is comfortable with that, but those that are, that opportunity would be there. But I also wasn't trying to add more people into City Hall at a time where numbers are up and carrying.
And I'm sorry, I misunderstood the original question. So I think what the mayor has wanted to do is to try and keep people outside. There's a large TV that the PIO has acquired. Of course, weather can affect that, and then letting people in only a few at a time into the chambers if we were meeting in person. But I can certainly check with the mayor about this particular opportunity, and we can firm it up and give the public some details about that.
Jesse, does that work for you, for us to get back some more details on the logistics of that? And also 1 o'clock in the afternoon is so hot. I'm not sure how much I would want, but that would be a deterrent for people to come down. But so does this give enough sharing of for us to talk next time about making sure we're getting and then you guys can give us some more details on whether that survey, how we could use that, or maybe even multiple times, Jesse, we're pushing something out for feedback. I can also see that would also work after we get to the point of it being to the full mayor and commission type thing. Anything else that staff wants to share or that committee members want to get feedback on? Nikki, did you have a specific homework assignment for us?
No, not specifically.
Okay.
If there are questions that you all, believe that need to be answered or that you'd like to answer, I would recommend that you do so. And, let's start a little email thread amongst us, and we can kind of track things that way. And just as a primer for the next meeting, we will be hearing from other communities that are doing this. This will be a great opportunity for us to learn what to do, what not to do, maybe how we want to frame and scope our HRC.
Gotcha. Here's this. I think I do have the homework assignment. I was thinking that when we have these other communities present to us next meeting on the 2nd, that we could have maybe 3 questions. Nikki, how many? We asked each community like the same question type thing. So maybe we could start our email thread based on what we learned from Crystal today. What are 3 questions that we want to hear specifically from each of presenters? Does that sound like an idea y'all would want to relate?
So we're actually having presenters from these other communities?
Yes.
Is that clear? Okay.
Yes. And so I didn't want us to, they might be a little bit more like Crystal that interrupt me as I go along, but if we have multiple people presenting to us, I was thinking it might streamline and make consistent use of their time so we don't spin off on one presenter and the other presenter doesn't have the equitable time to present to us. So I want to hear what y'all think about that. Jesse's hand is up. Yep. What are you thinking?
I guess I just feel like before we're bringing in other communities' input, I'd love for us to answer the question as a group of quasi-judicial versus advisory. In that if we're not in agreement, let's hear from everybody about how it could go. But it sounded like earlier, I don't want to speak for Commissioner Thornton, but it sounded like at least she and I were thinking along the same lines. If all of us here are thinking along the same lines about being more about the advisory than the quasi-judicial, then I feel like that would help us hone, at least big picture, the kind of input we want to get and from who.
Yeah, Crystal has her hand up, so I'm hoping that she's going to actually address your question. But I wanted to add that it's already sort of lined up for the communities to be with us on the 2nd. So I don't want to undo the rhythm of that being part of our process. But that doesn't mean, so go ahead, Crystal.
Well, we are happy to be flexible with respect to the timing, and Assistant Manager Jones, please don't hesitate to interrupt me again if I'm off the wall in any way. But heading into this, we knew that we were going to need some fluidity. So far there is one community who has agreed to come and speak with you, our LRC, and we are working to get 2 additional communities who are willing to agree to come. And we were also planning to support you by sort of doing this in a bit of an interview style format. And we were actually thinking almost exactly what you shared, Commissioner Wright, asking the same 3 questions of each person who comes before you so that you're able to compare and contrast. And so our hope is that we would assist with asking the questions and sort of moving the conversation along, and then leave a brief window as far as Q&A. So if that's suitable to you, then we are happy to proceed in that way. The other quick thought that I wanted to share is we can also structure the next 2 or 3 presentations so that there's a window for you as a group to come to an agreement about some of the questions that have been shared in the presentation before. And so we can attempt to literally structure the time we spend together so that with each meeting, you're able to build on the meeting that took place before. If that's helpful to you, then we're more than happy to proceed in that way.
Crystal, I think that's a great idea. And, of course, I'll let the LRC members confirm. But I wanted to touch on Commissioner Huell's question. I thought I heard exactly what you heard, but maybe to Crystal's point, maybe this is, a point in time where we say, yes, an advisory committee is where we would want to go.
I'm leaning in that direction as well, but I guess I was also being open-minded to understanding from these other communities how they prioritized it. But if we feel like the advisory is the way we want to go, maybe the communities that are presenting to us are the very ones that have that advisory set up versus the quasi-judicial. Carol, what are you thinking? Avita's had to leave, so Carol, what are you thinking?
I was distracted for a minute, to be honest. I'm thinking that Crystal was like, in terms of, she's already thinking along, and this might not be answering your question, Allison, but she was thinking along the lines of those questions. Jesse was saying, like, let's figure out what the questions are. My gut feeling is like, okay, Crystal's already going in that direction. Let her send out those directions and send out those questions, and then sort of like get some feedback if we see there's something that's missing. In terms of the quasi-judicial, my leaning is to do it towards the advisory, but I also just want to hear a little bit more before making a final decision on that. I love the idea of building in some what Crystal was talking about, instead of building in some discussion so we can get to the decision points as we're moving forward.
Okay, that sounds good to me too, because I think as a committee and community discussions, we're going to need to explain to people this probably first decision, right? As far as the type of group being advisory versus quasi-judicial. And I think if we learn a little bit more about it, that's going to help us make sure, communicate the community expectations, that's what they want, as well as expectations for the individuals, right? That we can explain why it's not doing this or why it is doing that. So did we make it more complicated, staff, or is that good feedback?
Good.
Good feedback. Okay. All right. Well, we've got a couple more minutes. Are we, I guess, to the point of confirming the quorum for the 2nd? I can't believe September's here, but it is.
I'll be there. Got all those meetings on my calendar. Great having them in advance.
Yeah. Before the next doodle poll comes out, we've got our spots.
Thank you, Sarah.
I am a little confused about when the larger commission retreats are, if there was any change on that. But so I'd appreciate getting any of that sooner than later.
Yeah, LRC can show people what a doodle poll can do. We're going to have a quorum each time. We're going to get this done. All right, so we're set, and I'll just do the reminder, and we'll just keep everything going. And Jesse and Sherry has her hand up as well.
Just wanted to give a heads up in advance that the 9th looks like the most tenuous day. I can't be here because I've got a mandatory training for my position on the IDA. I think Sherry on the doodle poll said that she can't be here, and Mariah will still be on maternity leave. So just maybe to have in mind that if y'all want to proceed with the 9th, you'll really need the remaining 3 of y'all here the whole time for it to work. But other than that, I'm good for the 2nd, excited for it.
Okay, Sherry.
Excellent. I just wanted to let you all know I will be out of town all next week. And I also want to introduce Lisa Pappas. I know you guys have probably seen her here on the video, but she is our new assistant county attorney, and we are so happy to have her. But she's going to be helping me with the LRC when needed moving forward. So she'll be here with you guys next week. And if the meeting moves forward on the 9th, she'll be there for that as well. So we'll tag team this topic.
Okay. All right. Anything else, Nikki, and your team?
Not for me.
All right, I'm looking for a motion.
So moved to adjourn.
Second.
All in favor of adjourning? Woo!
Aye.
Right on time. Okay, thanks everybody. Appreciate this. This is really good work. I appreciate that presentation and talk.
Bye-bye.